First item is we need a motion to approve the agenda.
So move.
Second.
Mr. Burgess, Mr. Ransom, all in favor? Passes 5-0. Next on our agenda is communications to the board, and we have business services. Mr. Adams.
Good evening again, board members and Dr. Branch. The Oconee County Schools Business Service Report for July 8th special session contains one action item. And the action item is the adoption of the fiscal year 25 millage rate. The board approved the final budget and tentatively adopted a millage rate of 15 mills at the June 10th board meeting. With the release of the final tax digest from the Oconee County Tax Commissioner, Oconee County Schools recommends a millage rate of 14.25 mills, which is a decrease of 0.75 mills from last year's millage rate. On the screen and available as a handout to those in attendance here tonight, you will see our budget calendar. As a reminder, the budget process began in February by reviewing division budgets, then staffing allotments, and school allotments. The board tentatively adopted the budget on May 13th. The required budget hearings were held on May 22nd and June 3rd, prior to the final adoption on June 10th. The final and tentative mills of 15.0 were reviewed and approved at the June 10th meeting. Budget information presented at these meetings can be found on Assembly and all our social media accounts. An updated budget, for which a handout has been made, available on the same handout as the budget calendar in the back of the room and upon check-in, reflects revenues based on final tax digest and recommended millage rate of 14.25 mills. This updated budget is also located on our website and social media accounts and on the screen above. The law requires the millage rate to be advertised as a property tax increase as a result of the assessed values of the properties of Oconee County being greater than they were last year. The required advertisements were published on the school district website, social media accounts, and the legal organ on June 27th and July 4th. And the required hearings took place on 7/1 and tonight at 6 p.m. All requirements have been satisfied for the adoption of the final millage rate. I ask the superintendent recommend approval of the fiscal year 25 millage rate of 14.25 mills. And that concludes my report unless there are any questions.
Thank you. Next on our agenda is action items. And we have millage rate.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Argo. We'd recommend that the board vote to adopt the FY 2025 millage rate of 14.25 mills.
We need a motion. Mr. Burgess?
Ms. Argo, if I could take a minute, I'd like to make a couple of comments.
Okay.
I've sat here for 3 hearings now and listened to a lot of comments and a lot of questions, a lot of concerns, a lot of issues raised by a number of people, and I felt like now was maybe an appropriate time to try to respond to some of those that I've heard today. I mean, in the last 3 hearings, to put a few things on the record in case some of this is not reported by our friends in the media. One of the statements that have been made several times by a number of people is a criticism about the rampant spending of our school system. And I find that kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. The Department of Education publishes data every year that ranks all school systems from 1 to 180 of their expenditures per student across the whole state. And if you look at that data on audited data from the Department of Education, you find that in 2022, in last fiscal year, 2 fiscal years ago, we ranked 173 out of 180 school systems. In other words, there were only 7 school districts in the whole state that spent less per student. There were only 7 systems in the state that spent less per student than we did. If you go to 2023, the last fiscal year that was audited, we ranked 169th out of 180, which meant there were only 11 school systems that spent less per student than we did. So in the last 2 years, we've been at the very bottom of expenditures per student in the entire state. All the while maintaining what, by any measure, is one of the best, if not the best, school system in the entire state. So the fact, and so what that says to me is we've been very prudent and practical and effective with the expenses that we've made in our school district to spend as little as we could but get the highest value for each one of those expenditures. My years in the public sector, in the financial world of the public sector, was always driven by a mantra that people want to see themselves and their tax dollars being used for full value. And I think those statistics and those expenditure levels represent to me, and the academic standards of our school system and achievements represents to me that we've done just that. We are spending the revenues that we are asking to be put into the school system to achieve an incredible level of excellence. And that, to me, is the total opposite of a challenge that we are spending rampantly in our school system. There's also a statement made in one of the hearings about the fact that this budget, the revenues exceed expenditures. And I don't understand where that came from, because Mr. Adams has given to us, he's put in the back of the room for everybody to get a budget, a set of expenditures and revenues based on what we're talking about in terms of the millage rate. And just to remind everybody, it generates about $113.5 million in revenues, but our budget expenditures level that we've approved is $114.9 million, which is a difference of about $1.3 million or almost $1.4 million. So we are actually we in fact have a budget that has a greater level of expenditures than the revenues that we're expected to draw from the millage rate that we're considering. Now, you've heard me in the past be critical of that because that's an unbalanced budget. But I think what we've talked about this year is a desire to drop the tax burden on our citizens to the point, to a level that we thought we could appropriately manage and still have a reasonable financial reserve to run our school system. So the net effect of what we're talking about doing tonight is actually taking almost $1.4 million out of our fund balance. We've been criticized about having a fund balance, period, but we're talking about taking $1.4 million in this fiscal year 25 budget and taking that out of our fund balance to balance our expenditure levels, which takes our fund balance down to a level that Peter has told us several times will be probably a couple $1 million below what the Department of Education itself recommends that every school system have as a basic operating reserve of 2 months. But I think that's another example of us hearing what people have said and being willing to lower our fund balance to a point below maybe a point where it's prudent, but one that we think we can manage through while still meeting our expenditure levels. There's also been the statement made several times about we're spending millions and millions of dollars in a school system without huge growth in our student population. There's two ways to look at that. First, that's not true on its face, because if you remember, Ms. Katie showed us a chart, and Peter's shown us a chart several times, that talks about our base operating continuation budget for our school system is about $700,000 less in fiscal 25 than it was in fiscal 24. In other words, we started with a continuation level of operating that's $700,000 less next year than it was this year for roughly the same number of students. But then we get to, okay, now what level of improvements do we think are needed or necessary in our school system for next year? And Peter's shown us this chart multiple times. So yeah, there's about $9.6 million in additional expenditures over that base level of operation that we've considered and approved for next year's operating budget. But what are they? What are they? It's a pay raise for our school teachers and all of our employees of 4%. I've heard no one suggest that that's not, well, I won't say no one, but I've heard almost no one suggest that that's not appropriate and desired and earned by our employees, starting with our teachers in our school system. We're also adding over $2 million to put step increases for our most seasoned and experienced employees all the way out to 30 years of their tenure. Again, an expensive item, but one that we felt like rewards the employees that have been with us the longest, that are our most seasoned. Another $2.2 million that we're adding to support the health insurance program. I've not heard anyone suggest that we shouldn't maintain and support health insurance for all of our employees. Same thing with retirement system. We're putting in almost $500,000 to support the retirement system. And have we ever suggested that a retirement system for our teachers and our employees is not a valuable benefit that helps us recruit and retain employees? We're adding positions of $1 million in new positions. More than half of those are special ed, parapros, and teachers and others that are involved in the special education functions of our school system, in addition to some additional clerical support for both human resources and business services, which have seen their workloads grow dramatically in the last number of years, and we're finally addressing that. And then finally, $350,000 for new curriculum. That's 6 years in the making that Susan Stansel has talked about to us on and on and on about, to not only modernize our curriculum, but to meet the new standards that the state has put in place. So yeah, we're adding $9 million to this budget, but those are what we're adding them for, and I've not heard anyone criticize any of those items and suggest that any of those particular items should not be included in this budget. And then last, the one comment that I heard that I thought was interesting, because it hit on a point that you've heard me talk about multiple times over the last year, and she was right on when she talked about our bonded indebtedness for our ELOS program, and how our bonded indebtedness for this ELOS program that we're currently in, that produced this building, Dove Creek Middle, expansions to every one of our elementary and improvements at our middle schools, the bonded indebtedness outlives the life of that ELOS. But that's exactly, and that was a valid criticism. That was a valid point for her to make. But what she didn't also recognize was it's the very reason we've committed almost $15 million in a reserve that escrows the amount of money necessary to make sure that when that ELOS is over, the revenues will be there to pay that bonded indebtedness that will be due for several more years after that ELOS is over. And the interesting part about that is, in hindsight, what we did several years ago when we sold those bonds is like financial wizardry now. Because we sold those bonds, and our interest rate on those bonds was 1.2%. So we'll be paying debt for several more years at 1.2%, using dollars that are generated in an environment that's well above 1.2%. And all of that will be protected with an escrow account that's part of our committed fund balance. It's another example of the prudency and the fiscal responsibility that I think this board has exhibited that protects all of us as we go forward with our financial operations. And then one last comment I want to make, because I've not heard this mentioned by anybody, and I hope our friend Mr. Becker or others will actually remind people of this. If you are one of those individuals in our community who has availed yourself of the senior citizen exemption that you get at 65, this budget will actually produce for you a reduction in your property tax bill. I, for one, am one of those. And I'm going to benefit from that because I'm over 65, and I hope there are a lot of other individuals in this community who have availed themselves of that opportunity as well. But that will also be a benefit for a lowered millage rate, because they will actually see a reduction in their property tax bill when it comes out in October, November. I'm going to stop there. There were other things that were brought up, but I just felt like I wanted to put those things out there as responses to some of the things that have been raised, the way I foresee our fiscal operation, and the very reason that I am very, very comfortable that what we're doing is both fiscally responsible, but it's also meeting the demands and expectations of a very high-performing school system that we all have come to expect here in Oconee County.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Anyone else? Dr. Branch, would you repeat what the action item is again, please?
Yes, ma'am. We recommend the board adopt the FY 2025 millage rate of 14.25 mils.
Thank you. We need a motion to approve.
So moved.
Mr. Hammack?
Second.
Mr. Ransom? All in favor? Passes 5-0. Next on our agenda, we do have a need to go into executive session and need a motion to do so.
I'll make a motion that the board will adjourn to executive session to discuss or deliberate upon personnel matters as described in the affidavit to be attached to the minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Parrish.
Second.
Second, Mr. Ransom. All in favor? Passes 5-0.